Yes, I can.
Yes, we can hear.
Oh, and I can't hear you, so I'm going to turn the volume up. Okay, good morning, everybody. We're really excited to welcome you to our first global webinar with CBU. The topic today is long-term positioning. We are generally trying to, within CBU, be more active on this front and provide better support to both our country offices as well as our HQ units on how we can just position better. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to hand it over to Sean Maloney, who will be giving this training today. He'll give a presentation for the first half of the training, and then we'll open up for questions and take those either via chat, or if you're able to speak up, feel free to do that when we reach that point. So Sean, can you hear me?
I hear you great. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. So, Sean, I believe you can share your screen from your side and we'll jump into it.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, can you make it full screen?
Yep, I'm just going to do the slideshow here.
Perfect. Yep, looks great.
Great. Hi, everyone. This is Sean. For those of you who don't know me, I do all of the sort of USG whispering within CARE USA. I'm based in Washington. I've worked with a lot of you on sort of figuring out how you can meet with USAID, improve your engagement with them. And for those of you I don't know, I look forward to meeting you one of these days. Hopefully we'll get COSLO going back again, and we'll have people coming to DC and visiting USAID and other possible partners. We're now working with USDA, with the Department of Labor. We, of course, do stuff with states PRM. So a lot of exciting stuff happening with us in the USG. For this meeting, I'm going to try to run through this PowerPoint as quickly as we can because I want to spend a lot of time with your questions. I have a great list of questions that came from folks ahead of time, which I've been able to kind of think through. So we'll talk about those and then make sure we hit as many questions or comments as we can get out of the group. So with that, let me just run through this. What is long-term positioning? Why does this matter? Long-term positioning is the continuous and ongoing process of strategically planning and acting to grow CARE's USG funding portfolio. We call long-term positioning phase 1 in our impressive BD guide, which is, of course, available on SharePoint. We really need to get better at knowing about our funders, about their trends. We need to get the intel, and that most of that, I do a lot of that in Washington, but most of the good intel comes directly from the field. And then we need to influence bid opportunities long before USAID is forecasting them. If something pops up on the forecast and we don't know about it, typically it's just too late. We really need to know that that's coming, and we'll talk about ways you can do that. Long-term positioning allows CARE to influence the way our donors think. We aren't just here reading the forecast, bidding on things, and then writing proposals just to match the donor's needs. I mean, of course, proposals have to match the donor's needs, but our influence, the way that we do our work is really important. And on the long-term positioning piece, we really have an opportunity to be sort of influencing how the donor is thinking before they're sitting down and writing these procurements. So we need to really make sure that we're a resource, particularly for USAID as they go forward. But we're also doing great work. We've got at least some kind of new contact, and I'll use Cote d'Ivoire as an example. And I don't know if anybody from that office is on the call. I know Alistair had a conflict. But Alistair and Guillaume have done sort of great work kind of talking to MCC as they set up shop in Abidjan. And so, I don't know if anything will come of that. MCC is in a bit of a peculiar space at the moment. But that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing if at all possible. So our reputation, we obviously need to have a good reputation. I shouldn't have to tell anyone that, when you sit down, it's just like us, or we sit down, if you think of World Vision in a place, or Mercy Corps, or CRS, or how you feel about the USG, and a particular USAID office with the State Department, everyone has a reputation. We need to make sure that ours is really a reputation for excellence and quality. So relationships are really obviously important. I'm not going to read through this entire slide. You guys will have it. But I mean, I think some of the key points that I want to highlight is, we really can engage and influence. And to do that, we really just have to be prepared. I know that sometimes having the right materials can be a challenge, but I urge folks to make sure you have fresh, updated, and relevant materials when you march into meetings, particularly with USAID. And I think beyond the typical sort of meeting at going over to the embassy or the USAID building, whatever you have in your particular country. Yeah, I think it's really important to be engaging sort of outside the halls of officialdom. I always say, if you've got kids who play soccer, make sure they're playing soccer on the same team with USG people. Um, Making these sort of relationships happen is the best way to get sort of all the intel and to be kind of influencing folks.
Hey, Sean, if I can add one more point to that, I think one of the things that I observe sometimes is there's a tendency to really want to emphasize, for example, a country director's relationship with the mission director. That is absolutely important, but we are interacting, particularly through our program implementation, at all levels with USAID. So our technical people who are meeting for that quarterly check-in, with their USAID counterpart on a project, or anybody who has any friends. I went to college with some of the people at your funder. All of those relationships matter, and all of those are an opportunity to engage and to build the reputation of care with our client, as well as to influence the way they think about development. So we really want to make sure that everybody understands that whatever your engagement is with the funder, it is valuable, it is important, and it is a way to help on the long-term positioning.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. Yeah, I mean, I can't stress enough the fact that this is not a job just for a country director, to try to go to meet with the USAID mission director or the deputy mission director. One of the great things about USAID, in my opinion, where they have at least full missions, is that they do tend to have a pretty good staff, and they're fairly organized around sector. You've got a program officer who's one of the best resources, and so oftentimes we can find we can often find somebody in our world who kind of matches the role and responsibilities of the USAID folks. And I will say that they do love that. Like, we should be forging relationships at all levels, but from the USG perspective, those levels have to match up. So meaning I wouldn't send somebody who's brand new and junior, alone to meet with the deputy mission director or the mission director. You send the country director for that, or the RSPD, or both. You send the DRG folks to talk with the DRG folks, the gender folks to talk with gender folks. Things like that sort of make the most sense to use it. So I'll move along here. And folks should feel free to stop me if it's like something urgent that can't wait until the end for questions. Yeah. All right, can you guys still hear me, Christy? My screen just
keep going.
Great. Awesome. What other relationships matter for us? I would say, beyond the USG, showing off our ties to local government, I think, has been one of the strongest ways that we show USAID that we mean business and are real sort of operators in a place. And then, of course, knowing the other stakeholders, having private sector partnerships. I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about what's going on at USAID. But the private sector has, been growing in importance over the past 10 years, I would say, in development writ large. Even in the, there's even private sector partnerships in the humanitarian space now. There's just all sorts of stuff going on. The private sector is hot. And I think it's probably even more important at USAID today than it was 5 years ago. And even then they took it pretty seriously, and there were lots of opportunities. So really having these relationships and showing those off is extremely important. And then of course, knowing the other implementing partners, knowing who's who, who possesses, the technical expertise on particular, in particular sectors. Basically, just showing that off to the USG is super important. And then I always say, like get to know the multilaterals, the African, Development Bank, to use Africa as an example, is sort of a rising star, and really looking to sort of increase their influence and work on more projects. So, to me, that's a huge opportunity and I know Kavina was doing that for East Africa. Of course, she's left us, which is sad to me. But, those sorts of things really sort of critical. I love this little cartoon. Everyone looks at LinkedIn. If you think people aren't searching for you on LinkedIn before you have a meeting, you're crazy. Okay, moving on. I'll get this to go. It's a little bit slow here. Come on, PowerPoint. There we go. The most critical things you can learn today, the secret to business development, is knowing your client. And for us, our biggest client is obviously USAID. I think we have a lot of data on them. They've really, really improved their web presence. And so things that were previously extremely hard to sort of look up using the Google are now far easier when it comes to USAID. I would say the big exception to that is it's really hard. You don't really know what USAID is doing in a country online until much after the fact, right? They don't, they have like blogs and stuff, but looking at numbers, seeing the size of programs, especially when they start up, it sometimes takes a couple of years to see those things. And so that's intel that you've got to get on the ground. This is finally working. Here, I'll just highlight all of these so you can look through them. Oops, sorry. One thing I think people don't think about enough is the overall size of U.S. government foreign assistance. What we call the 150 account, which is everything, it's everything we care about, really. So everything that we would possibly get is in there, including the USDA stuff. So the 150 account, the request that the president made was for $41.7 billion. That seems kind of crazy for a president who has vowed to cut aid. But I think it shows off how important the issue is for the Congress. And so they've tried, I think the last request was for 20-something billion, and Congress enacted an over $40 billion bill. This time around, the bill that was just signed last week to avoid yet another government shutdown was $56.1 billion. Now, a lot of that is operating the State Department. There's billions, it's like $10 billion to operate USAID. But USAID is likely, we don't quite have the exact numbers yet, but it's in the over $20 billion range. It's a huge chunk of money. It's by far the world's biggest bilateral donor, by far. USAID is more than twice the size of DFID, just to give people an idea. And they're the next biggest bilateral donor. So it really, I can't stress how important the USG is, particularly USAID, which is really where most of the action is. But we've done a great job cultivating new relationships and getting funding from other USG agencies. Christie went out and got that Timor-Leste McGovern-Dole, and that puts us, right back in with USDA, with whom we'd had a sort of a past history, but one that had fizzled out. But we are back in a big way and looking at doing more McGovern-Dole. And so that's really a huge, those are massive long-term projects, so really great for the country offices where those exist. We have a great relationship with the State Department, really thanks to our humanitarian team. And so that's going extremely well. On things like, Department of Labor, again, the opportunities are sort of smaller, but it's been a huge new relationship for us. We just won a DOL bid, and we hope to do more with them. And MCC, things were going great out. They don't have a head of MCC. They're sort of just not being extremely active. But they are, they did have a call in West Africa, for instance, on gender and women's economic empowerment that we were kind of looking for. But it was, it was maybe for $200,000, or if somebody remembers on the call, it was not a lot of money. And there were just some challenges with the entire process on their end. But I will make sure I let people know when they are sort of back up and sort of strong like they used to be. But also, if you have MCC in your country, I mean, that like definitely don't avoid them and see if you can help them out, because I think in terms of long-term positioning, that'll come back to benefit us. Okay, strategic planning. This is something I know we all, frankly, struggle with, even our, strategy shops. But it really is just hugely important to plan for our USG growth. I mean, we've got to have a goal-setting process. We need to know who the potential funders are. We need to know what their sort of milestones are. We've done a great job with Dr. Tom Roden of getting these landscape analyses out, and he fields tons of requests and has been super responsive in getting high quality landscape analyses out for your particular countries. So continue to use those and continue to ask for those. Those are really awesome, Tom, if you want to get on the call, but you do a great job with those.
John, maybe we can just let people know what the landscape analysis is for those who don't know.
Sure. Oops. Why is this doing this to me? Yeah, so we have a little, it's a couple of pages on which breaks down what the donor situation looks like in a particular country. Obviously, with most information on USAID, but Tom tries to find whatever he can and put it in there. And we've got great sort of graphical representations of how the sectors look at a particular country. Is your country 85% health funding? Is it 55% health funding? It sort of just allows you to have a baseline for what's happening. Who are the key players? Sort of all the things you would need to know to make an educated decision about, possible directions that you want to go in. I don't know if Tom is on and wants to say something, or if Christy, you want to add to that.
That was great. I think the only thing to add is that that is available for all of our country offices. So if you would like some additional support, research, analysis on what the U.S. government's doing in your country, simply email us at our standard email, and we will work with you to get that done. Similarly, you can see on here, USG funder cultivation plans, forecasting, advice on donor trends, support for business planning. All of those are services that CBU offers. You just simply need to reach out to us, and we're more than happy to support you with that.
Yeah, and you need to let us know what your strategic priorities are. That's super helpful. Here we go. Yeah, I love this cartoon. At the end of the day, you can only strategize for so long. And we recognize that sometimes you're going to go for opportunistic things. It's going to happen. Sometimes, Intel is going to just avoid us altogether, and things are going to drop that are right in our wheelhouse, and we're going to scramble. But I think, I think what Christy and the rest of CBU would like to say is, that's mostly in our past. And these days, we really need to position ourselves. And part of that is through this long-term positioning process, but we need to know things are coming out because, as we said before, and as everyone knows, once something comes out, if we haven't pre-positioned for it and done all the capture work that we need to do, it becomes very, very hard to be successful. All right. How do we become a preferred partner? And I've seen this in my time here, which is almost coming up on 2 years this summer. There are parts of the USG world that just don't know. They know the CARE brand. They've heard of CARE. They just don't really know who we are. So, way down here at the bottom of the arrow is the unknown partner. That's a bad place to be in. We want to be a known partner, and then we want to use being a known partner to become a preferred partner. So if you're a preferred partner, you've really got a competitive advantage. I mean, this is so clear in the humanitarian space. Our humanitarian team would tell you that, they get phone calls about how we can help in particular places or how we can influence what needs to happen as they think through their programming needs and where to put money. We're just hugely influential players in the humanitarian space because we are a preferred partner and a super known partner. So we want to be creating as many opportunities as we can to just exchange ideas with funders. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail as we go on. Christy will walk us through what happened in Somalia. I think it's a great example of really influencing how USAID does things and how they design an entire program. In this case, it was a huge program. So Christy, do you want to walk us through that?
Yeah, so before we dive into kind of how do you become a preferred partner, we wanted to highlight for you some of the successes that we've observed in the last year or so. One of those is Somalia. Somalia was actually a couple years back, we did not have a very strong reputation with USAID in the education sector, despite the fact that we are the major implementer of education projects in Somalia. To the point that in kind of some pooled funding, USAID actually tried to block us from getting an award because they just didn't think we were the right fit for doing education in Somalia. Through the efforts of the education team as well as CARE Somalia, they were actually able to completely flip that relationship. And it really wasn't that complicated in how they did it. It was simply serving as a resource and a thought partner. They would actively share reports, evaluations, all of the things that they were doing, particularly emphasizing the results. They were also, participating in working groups as well as any events that USAID was holding locally around education. And what they were able to do was really to highlight CARE successes in Somalia, and really not just that we were doing the education work there, but that we were incredibly successful and we were getting real results, which others implementing similar projects weren't getting those results. And so what we were able to do, well, I can't take any credit for this, so what they were able to do was actually to just grow our reputation to the point that it turned from not just being about a reputation, but really influencing the way that the mission thought about education. When we saw a contract come out last year, it was really quite surprising to see how much USAID had adopted our approaches and generally our way of thinking about education programming in Somalia. So we went from a client who didn't really think very highly of us to a client who adopted much of what we were doing simply because we were getting results, and that was important to them. I can highlight a couple of other examples. Last year we had in Egypt, McGovern Dole was looking at doing a brand new project in Egypt. They had heard about CARE's reputation implementing in Egypt, and so they called them and said, we hear you're doing great work. We're designing this project, and we'd like to hear a little bit more about the context and what's working well and what's not working well. Another opportunity to influence the way that the client was thinking about the problems in Egypt. And we actually didn't end up going after this, but we multiply our impact whenever we're able to help our clients understand what are the challenges as well as what are some of the potential solutions to addressing development or humanitarian issues in a particular country. Another example, we had a governance meeting. We had the team from CARE UK here to meet with the USAID DRG team. And it was interesting there. We've been talking for a while of how can we kind of grow in this sector. What we got from that meeting was they were actually really interested in our health system strengthening work. And so that's created a potential niche that we might be able to explore with USAID about where we can be competitive. And then finally, the corporations team, their work on private sector engagement actually created, I was sitting at a meeting earlier this year in which someone from the USAID Private Sector Engagement Office highlighted CARE as being one of the strongest organizations I've ever seen in private sector engagement. So a couple of points here is just really it's about getting our great work out there. Whenever we do that, whenever we can show that we're achieving results, that our theory of change for development or humanitarian programming is making a difference and having an impact, that's attractive. Remember that most donors, well, pretty much all donors, are not implementers, right? They rely heavily on implementers to inform the way that they approach development and humanitarian programming. So these are just a few examples of what we've seen in last year of just successful long-term positioning efforts.
Thank you, Christy. Can you on the Somalia example, for instance, are there a few things that they did that you saw, or I don't know if anybody from that team or from EXA is on the call. I think it just might be interesting to highlight one or two of the sort of approaches they took in kind of getting to USAID and really influencing them.
Yeah, I can give a couple, and if anybody from that team is here, I'm happy to have them chime in. I think one of the first things is they understood that long-term positioning is about leveraging relationships at all levels. This was not a country director, mission director sitting down and having this conversation. This was tech folks talking to tech folks. And that's really important for us to realize, is that we really have to leverage all of those relationships. The other thing they did is they actively shared information. Every time they had a new report or something that was interesting where they got new results or whatnot, they would just email it over and say, hey, we just wanted to let you know that we got some new results on this and it's really interesting. They wouldn't just send them kind of the massive 50 or 100-page document. They would highlight what was really important. And then they also participated in technical fora. So technical working groups, or generally when there were meetings, they would reach out to just highlight what we were doing. I'll stop there. Those are the three things that stood out to me. I don't know, I'm looking at the participant list. We have a lot on the line or not. Doesn't look like it. But from my perspective, those were the things that made them really successful. And what I would point out here, it wasn't that complicated, right? This wasn't, getting some really high-powered meetings or whatnot. It was simply technical people sharing technical expertise with their counterparts at USAID and really emphasizing results. It's one thing to just do good programming, but when we can attach it to results, that's when our clients really start to perk up and become very interested in how we're getting those results.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that I know it can be difficult to get in with, say, a USAID in certain countries, or we just may not have, the relationship may have sort of died down over the years, and a country office comes in and wants to reestablish it. We can absolutely help with that. So if you don't have, your own inroads in with some of the tech people or the program officer or whomever, then make sure you let us know that. And we're happy to sort of guide you through that process and try to hook up an original meeting. Okay, if this would just move, that would be great. Come on, computer. There we go. I love this, the red arrow. In terms of long-term positioning, this is what we call the 5 C's. But know your client is really just, this is what we've been talking about. It's just so critical to understand what the client is up to, and it really is useful to understand kind of globally. And you'll see if you use Workplace, which I highly, highly encourage everyone to do, because I share a ton of USG information on Workplace, both specific things and then a lot of the news articles that come out that are relevant. Some of USAID's own, blogs, updates from the administrator, et cetera, I put on there. And all of that, so at the global level, understanding the client and what they're trying to do sort of globally. And then, of course, at the local level, understanding the local context, understanding your competition, understanding what we can do as CARE, and figuring out how to make a strong consortium. are all really critical. If this, okay, this is now moving, great. Business intel, this is super critical. It's super critical not just for you guys in the field to be really collecting business intel, but then to also be sharing it back with us so that we can get ready for opportunities as they arise. So, we really need to understand a client's priorities and preferences. We should be marketing CARE's work. We need to show what our capacity is. We need to, almost brag about our experience to the donors and partners. And I'll say here that one of the best ways to do that is by being active on things like a humanitarian team in a particular country, or one of the sectoral teams that get together with all the different implementing partners and donors, and really showing off some thought leadership in those, and talking about what we've learned from our programming. So we need to gain information about upcoming USG funded opportunities. We need to do this before bids are released. Again, I think it's important to note that a lot of our competition spends a lot more time on the sort of intel gathering, and can be better hardwired into things before they go live. I've seen this where we know these things really well in advance for particular countries because somebody has done the intel work, somebody's built the relationships to have, say USAID telling them this is happening, while they're getting ice cream in Kampala. So really making sure that we're getting that intel is just so critical. And it's just, it's really the most important thing in the first step in the business development process. When info matters, and I can talk a little bit more specifically about USAID at the end in terms of what's sort of attractive to them right now. But we really have to know what they're up to, what are their priorities. It's like I said, globally, you can sort of see the direction USAID's going in, a much bigger focus on the private sector. I'll talk about the journey to self-reliance at the end of this, which is really the lens through which the administrator of USAID sees everything. And so they're really sort of adapting their programming. It's not going to change massive projects too much in the immediate future, but they really are. They're rejiggering. aid is going through an entire new strategy process. Each country is going to do a new CDCS. There's already a few pilot ones that are well underway. And the good news with the USAID is their priorities, and even down to the sector level, are pretty clear. If you read their strategies, which are all available online, and I do recommend reading the old ones. Just because they're doing new strategies doesn't make the old strategies irrelevant. In fact, this process is incremental, and given these strategies are developed completely in line with host country governments, you might see a change in region or a change in approach, but overall, these things tend to tackle the same areas, improve on stuff that they've learned, get out of things that maybe just weren't valuable. But so I really encourage folks to read the old strategies, because you just really get a sense of what they're looking for. So let me run down this. Be aware of mission and HQ staff, like who are the people who are running the show in your sector or in the programming that you care about. Understand what are the things that really get the USG excited. And I'll talk a little bit about the new sort of women's economic empowerment track that's taking off at USAID. I'll talk about that in a bit. Make sure you know when the meetings are taking place, and participate in those when possible, especially the USAID sponsored ones. Make sure that we're scheduling in-country planning meetings to tackle these issues, together as CARE. Make sure that, I don't know why that did that. Make sure that we've got sort of all of our potential partner info lined up. Make sure we understand the competitive landscape. Let's see. I just don't want to read all of these because that will bore everyone to death. Understanding the latest technical trends, like what's hot in your particular country, who are the innovators, what's the government talking about, what is USAID talking about. I should say it's not in here, like local news. I mean, the first thing I always do when I travel abroad to a care country or a USAID country before that in my previous career is watch the local news and see, because in a developing country, there's always like one news story about some project happening, some governor on, cutting the ribbon on something new, and I find those really telling about what's interesting to the host government and what plays with sort of people, sort of interesting to watch those. Let me move on to this. Technical excellence, obviously, just super important. We can't do projects that aren't working and talk about those. Like we really need to be, showing that our stuff is working, and then we need to talk about that, right? So we need to attend thought leadership events, create thought leadership events. Let me get through this. Things we can do, and I've seen some excellent things, particularly on VSLAs, particularly on gender, but we really should have white papers on everything that we're doing. Make sure we're publishing our stuff, make sure we're going to events, and like I said, even setting up our own events. And we've been talking about this in Washington. We haven't done it yet, but there are obviously a bunch of think tanks. We have a bunch of partners. There's USAID, which is happy to work with us on joint events, particularly on the hot button issues, like gender or the private sector. And we have, as Christy was saying earlier, we've got these incredible private sector relationships, long-standing relationships with companies like Cargill and Mars, Pepsi. Obviously, folks are aware of the sort of new refreshed engagement with Pepsi. And so we need to use that stuff to our advantage. I mean, it's just so important. And stuff we're doing in that space now really positions us, over the next 5 years, as the USG is developing their sort of new strategies. Like just knowing that we are doing this stuff is hugely influential.
So if I can just add one comment there, I'll go back to the Somali example. I think one of the things I'm struck by is how little we actually share things with our clients. When you have anything that you've put together that's highlighting your work, I mean, choose carefully. Don't send things that don't really have results to show. That's not going to be as effective. But if you have things that are highlighting your work in country, we absolutely want you to share that with your USG funders. Let them know what you're doing by simply emailing them a report with a high-level summary of, here's the results we achieved. That's an actual really great way to open up a conversation and for them to start reaching back to say, oh, well, that's interesting. We'd like to hear more about that. So the more active you can be in sharing some of that information, the better.
Yeah, I will. I'll just use a personal example here. When I was at AID, I absolutely hate, and this would happen to me all the time, and it happens to all AID folks. Even happens to care folks sometimes from like smaller groups that want to do work with us. But like the random, I have no idea who you are or what you're doing or even what your organization does, and like so sharing a document sort of randomly, blasting people obviously is not the most effective way to go, and it frankly drives me crazy. But once you've done the sort of work of relationship building and like the ag officer and what she is interested in, that's when you send like the great hey, hi Jennifer, thought you'd find this super interesting. I mean, that stuff is really impactful, right? And like AID loves to get those things. They want to be on top of everything. They want to know what's happening in their particular sector. So that's just a plug for forging those relationships, and then, sort of showing off our skills. All right. If I could get this to move. It does not like to get going again once I stop. Come on. All right. And we're stuck. There we go. Sorry, Zoom is being a little slow. I don't know if it's my connection. Active USG engagement and relationship management. CBU really recommends that you meet with people at least 3 times a year. I would do it more. And I would maybe do 3 times a year that are like official. You drop in to see them at their office. But, you ought to be meeting with them, at least once a month, the various, sectoral meetings, humanitarian teams, whatever is happening in country. And we all know that there's a ton of meetings. And I know it can be, nobody likes these meetings, obviously. But I think showing up, being present, and having something sort of educated or novel to say really helps us out. Again, we need to engage at all levels. Like, it's really just not just country directors that have to do this work. It's everyone, including even on the operations side, on the management side, compliance, like just knowing, like you said, knowing that we've got a solid group of people actually managing the finances of projects is also super useful. I mean, I think Christy mentioned earlier about aid stopping a procurement. Oftentimes if they do that, if they're saying, no, we absolutely cannot give X to some organization, it's because funds have been mismanaged, right? It's not usually like, oh, they don't know anything about the sector, so we can't give, it's the things that stop them cold are particularly where we're just not doing a very good job managing this stuff. And so building those relationships are also super useful. We need to use formal and informal opportunities. I'm a huge fan of the informal. I think that's where you build relationships beyond the sort of what's normal, right? Like, you really need to engage folks in the informal settings and create friendships essentially. Always, I can't emphasize this enough. It's like what I was saying with the sending random materials is not helpful. Requesting a random meeting is also not helpful. Like, you need to know why you're having a meeting. Why are you meeting with a particular person? What are they interested in? How do our programs match the priorities in country? I mean, I've seen this a lot where a particular care country is doing things that are really of relevance to the USG, but we're not framing it that way. And we tend to have, we tend to want to express our sort of development and humanitarian zeitgeist through documents, or using language that doesn't make a ton of sense to the USG. And that's fine. The way that we communicate with, say, private donors or foundations, needs to be and should be totally different from the way that we communicate with the USG. And I just really urge folks, I think if you get to know these people, you really are familiar with the USG priorities, it becomes very easy to simply translate what we're doing into a way that makes more sense for the US government. And like I say, this particularly like an SRHR, there are ways to basically say things where it absolutely makes sense, and you show pretty good alignment between what we're doing and what they want to do. So, yes.
John, I think one addition to that is that our recommendation is not that everybody goes out and just builds random relationships with USG people. We really want you to be focused and align it with the research that you've started out with. So remember, just going back earlier in the PowerPoint, we talked about the importance of getting to know your client. That is the first step here. Get to know your client, get to know what they're interested in, get to know what they're funding. And from there, you can prioritize which relationships you want to build. And to Sean's point, of really focusing on what are the things that are going to get them excited, and leveraging kind of your knowledge of the client to help you build a long-term relationship.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Christy. I mean, I do also think that you want to be very careful in your sort of targeting, but we also don't want to throw away the kind of random relationships that do happen. So while Christy's absolutely right, my headphones keep falling out. Christy's right that we absolutely should not be just going after everyone. We do need to embrace the things that sort of just happen, through serendipity. You're in the same meeting with somebody, you're on the same flight as somebody, you're on a project visit with somebody, and just making sure that you're always, business development is always happening. And so just always having that in mind that random relationships can help you in the future. That's all I'll say about that. If I can get this to work again, there we go. Who should have a relationship with the USG? We've talked about this now, I think, several times, driving it home. It's everyone. Really, everybody needs to be engaged. I hear this often that, oh, well, such and such a country just doesn't do anything with the USG. That's fine, but look at what the USG is up to and see where our current programming or things we might be interested in doing in the future might align. And it takes one conversation to sort of understand better what they're looking for, and it takes one proposal to get us sort of into the USG biz in a particular country. So Uncle Sam wants you. I will also say that USAID, even though they have people they prefer and we want to be a preferred partner in a particular country, you never know how these things are going to go. When they assess a project or a proposal, I should say, there are upsets, right? Like, it's the big boys and girls don't always win the massive projects or even the small ones. If something is in our wheelhouse, we should feel free. Even if we haven't done the long-term positioning, it's harder. But if we can do this long-term positioning, and something new pops up, I mean, there's really no reason that we can't win it. And of course, doing all these relationships really helps us influence them before they design new projects. So let me get through all these. How to be a resource. RFIs. You'll notice on the forecast, lots of RFIs are coming out. We've had a couple places say, yes, we absolutely want to do an RFI. And that's amazing. They're a lot of work. Do you get anything out of the RFI? No, you don't, except you are positioning yourselves as thought leaders. And I would assume in this day and age, it would be very, very hard to win something, to win an RFA, for instance, if you hadn't responded to the RFI and you're just showing up with a proposal at the end. So I think RFIs are really, really important. Make sure we have all the contextual information in there. Chrissy could talk about this, but we have, you sometimes when we lose things, you often in the debrief get feedback from USAID that it just wasn't, the contextual information wasn't there. So they just didn't know what we were going to do. And I love this point, donors are not implementers, right? Like they don't do what we do at all in the field. What they've done is they've become very skilled at reading these proposals, and they want to see details. And they also, as USAID has improved, monitoring, learning, and evaluation, they also do have some data to use. And so they want to see the context, they want to see the data. So we've got to do that, which brings me to evaluations. Like when we have evaluations or other learning documents, we need to share those. We need to make sure those are in our proposals, and that they are totally aware that we are, concerned with results and have the evaluations to prove them. Conferences, we talked a lot about that. Make sure we go to those. We should not hesitate to create meetings and conferences. We've often talked in Washington about how CARE should really do a big gender thing. Obviously, budgets are a bit tight at the moment, but I think it never hurts us to talk about these things and think them through. And sometimes you might find other implementers that want to go in with us on these things. Or foundations that want to fund, particular subject matter areas. Initiatives here, if you just skip down to this bullet, and I'll talk about the Ivanka initiative. That's a great opportunity when the government announces a new initiative. That's just huge for us. If it's in our wheelhouse, like when women's economic empowerment clearly is, we need to be talking to the donors about that. And we need to figure out ways, even if it means like spending a little bit of our money or making sure we're really kind of harassing all the parts of CARE that we need to harass to make sure that we can support both on the sort of initial development side of these initiatives and then of course on the implementation when they're going to be doing stuff. So last point, be social and be seen. It's very hard to build relationships if you just go between the CARE office and home all the time. I think being at meetings is the number one thing to increase visibility, but also just being out and about Obviously, there are lots of dinners, there are lots of special events that happen in the developing world context, and I know it can be a lot, and it can feel, some of us it feels kind of absurd to go and have a fancy dinner in an economically disadvantaged country, but this is how the world works. So and World Bank things are always the worst, but go to those.
Sean, I think one point to add to that is nothing on that list requires you to have active USG programming. Being a resource, anyone can do it. If you have a presence in country, if you're implementing things, you can achieve all of these. And being a resource, being a thought partner is one of the most effective things you can do in your long-term positioning efforts. Remember that on the client side, these are development people just like us, and sitting down and having that conversation with them and treating them really as partners in development is really effective when you're trying to move from being an unknown partner to a known partner and eventually to a preferred partner.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. All right, let's see. Oh, now, how dare I have muted myself and now this thing is not responsive. Oh, there we go. How do we build these effective USG relationships? Here are just some more, I've said most of this. You got to be visible. We need to be consistent in, sort of what we're saying. Make sure we don't send two people to two separate meetings with entirely different spiels about how we do things. That's bad. We need to make sure we're creating relationships at all the levels. Make sure that, and this is a major faux pas, like you don't want to win a massive project and then stop really informing, networking, seeing the USAID folks. Make sure that we're building relationships before, during, and after we have an active grant or contract. So we try to do more contracts. Knowing the client, we talked about this. Make sure one of the best ways to make sure that we're heard and taken seriously is to not, don't just build a relationship with one person and then have them leave the country and then you've got no connection to the aid mission. Make sure that you're sort of constantly monitoring, sort of who are the appropriate staff. How do you leverage the one person you do know to make sure you know others. And then have good marketing materials. Okay. What to do in a USG meeting? Make sure we plan these things in advance. Sometimes there's a little wiggle room with this because, as we all know, in the developing world, things are popping up constantly and things are shifting constantly. So you shouldn't hesitate to ask for a meeting last minute. But for me, last minute with the USG is really within a week. So if you're doing like 2 days, 1 day, 3 days, that's probably not enough time unless you know somebody really well, right? Like if you have a really good friend who works for USAID, well then, I think you can ask that person, use your own judgment. Like, can you ask them last minute? I do this all the time, frankly, for CARE, because there are certain people in the USAID world who are just really good friends of mine, and therefore I can call them and be like, hey, I know this is, 2 days away, and I'm sorry to do this, but would you mind meeting with so-and-so? And so based on your relationship, you can pull things off like that. But, the USG it can be very formal. It's extremely bureaucratic. The more in advance you can do things, the best. Be concise, be purposeful. Make sure you're listening to them in a meeting. Like that's really, I've seen that go awry too, where sometimes we're too eager to talk about our stuff that we're not listening to what the donor cares about. I would say we need to really do that first and then adjust our spiels based on what they're interested in. Make sure we're doing the long-term engagement, make sure we're sharing our ideas, and particularly focused around, results and impacts and sharing those studies that we have with them. Always do homework before a meeting. Look the person up, look at LinkedIn. It's helpful to, like, what was the country that they were in before? USAID foreign service officers move around from post to post, obviously. And then sometimes even therefore, USAID, a lot of you will meet with, what they call foreign service nationals. And so, if you're at the Kenya USAID mission, there are a whole lot of Kenyans who work for USAID and are the first line. And even very senior, FSNs can get extremely senior and can be like the ag expert or the health expert in the country. And while they'll report to a U.S. government official, a lot of times they run the show. And you even have, they even have third-party host countries. So, you'll get a Kenyan who works for USAID who will end up in Uganda or Ghana. And so people move around. So, I mean, make sure that you sort of know what they care about. And where they've been. Good icebreakers to talk about. Oh, I was in Kampala in the 1990s. So be open and honest. We don't want to. I'm a big fan of some sort of like subtle like BSD networking stuff, but you obviously. I mean, it sounds obvious, but you can't be really embellishing things too much. You want to be direct and really honest about the kind of work that we can do. Share info, make sure you build common ground. This point about don't just ask about the money is really an important one. And it goes back to what we're saying about how we can influence the donor. Excuse me. We're not going to necessarily start off our relationship by winning something in a country if we don't have current USG funding. But if we can influence them, if we can be helpful, and I'll talk about this with the We Act, there are things that USAID is simply not that great at. And if we show up and say, hey, we can help you with this, we're not here to say, hey, give us a massive grant to do this. We're just here to share our expertise. I think that's really valuable for long-term positioning. Make sure we invite folks to our things. I've seen very little of this. If somebody has a great example of this, I would love to see it. But, we often hold events and don't invite USG officials to go to those events, and that's a missed opportunity. Always send a thank you note. Never have a meeting. I mean, I always do this like immediately after. Just send a quick note. Thank you so much for your time, because they are busy and they don't have to meet with us, and so always thank them. All right, this is moving again. Don't forget about procurement integrity. This is why long-term positioning is so important. If there's not a procurement out on something, there's very little a USAID person can't tell you about what they're thinking. They can talk about their overall strategy in the country. They can talk about how they want to put most money into agriculture or health. They can tell you all these broad things that really help you get ready. What they can't do is tell you about a procurement once they have issued it. You can still ask very general things, and we can request things sort of online. Gil on our team does this all the time, where he issues official questions, and they can sometimes come back and they can answer them, because they can tell, they can't tell us something about a procurement, but what they can do is they can tell the entire world about the procurement. So as long as everyone is hearing something, they can answer questions, and they will. So don't expect special treatment, even from your friends. I mean, that stuff gets, and I have to, this is like what I spend a lot of my time doing. Since I do have so many friends in the USG, you can get special treatment in terms of like a response to an email, or setting up a meeting that somebody else wouldn't be able to get. But certainly on the money side, I mean, you don't ever want to create even the image or idea that you're somehow trying to exploit your relationships to get money. That's just very, very bad. It's bad beyond USG. But yeah, we definitely don't want to do that. Existing projects, like don't march into an awesome meeting that you set up at USAID to talk about, their newest Feed the Future project if we've been horribly implementing a project. And this does happen, right? Like this happens to all implementers. Sometimes you just have a project that's bust, or, a COP that, wasn't liked, or, all sorts of challenges arise, right? This is development business. It's actually really hard. Things go wrong, but back to being like honest, like don't go in somewhere if we're doing poorly and say, hey, we're so great, because they're going to know that we're doing poorly. Let's just say, yeah, be prepared. Some of these are a little repetitive. Don't just focus on our needs. Again, this is like, don't just ask for money. Don't just talk about our stuff and not listen to them. Let's see, marketing for our growth. I'm going to go really fast now because I want people to have time for questions. Make sure we're really marketing in person. Share our story, share specifics, talk about what CARE is good at globally. I always talk about our FNS programming. I always start with our gender lens through which we do absolutely everything, and that's becoming increasingly important, I think, to USAID. So that's a great opportunity for us. You know, make sure that if you're looking at, an education project in Somalia is coming out, what a great time to release a paper on education in Somalia. That's, for anyone, but then you can share with USG. And capacity statements, like really understanding and being able to share info on everything that we're able to do in a particular country is super useful, which is why we wrote it down 3 times.
Just a plug for capacity statements. We can help you with those. We won't write them for you. We don't have the resources to do that. However, we will help you to make sure that they are in a nice professional format. So if you want that support, just reach out to us. We're happy to
help. Thank you. So on in-person marketing, again, this really is what we all should be doing. Some of this is repetitive. What I will say is don't be shy. That working for CARE is pretty awesome, actually. And I'm constantly amazed by the number of USG folks who don't actually know what we do, but they know CARE, they know the brand, they know the logo, they know we're orange. They know we were kind of big in the past. People may not be aware of this, but we predate USAID by 2010. Well, I guess not that long, but by like 7-8 years. So we are not a much older organization, but we're an older organization, and we created this entire notion of an international NGO. So we should own that. It's pretty cool. Always have business cards. I shouldn't have to ever tell anybody that, but super important. Sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice here. Marketing for USG growth. Again, we've talked about some of this. Make sure that we're really masters of the specific info, and we need to be publishing stuff. We don't do this enough. I think we're better on the cap statements and like past performance, and those are super important, but we've got to be blogging, right? We've got to have this. My biggest pet peeve, I think, with CARE is this country fact sheet stuff. Like some countries have pretty good fact sheets that are up to date, and others have things that are so out of date that I would never share it with anyone. And this is obviously outside the realm of CBU, although we do talk about it a lot with folks in PPL and with the marketing team and the comms people. But the first thing somebody from USAID is going to do, either before meeting they have with you or right after, is like Google CARE, Rwanda, and see what the heck we're up to. And so we really do need to have like pretty accurate stuff there. We need to be, we need to be identifying these opportunities, so like let CBU know the second you even have, an inkling of what they might be up to. And we'll get a proposal manager on that right away to then make sure that the process goes smoothly and that we're doing the things that we have to do in that critical capture phase. Somebody will put all this information into AIMS. And so make sure you share it with us, and then we can track it, and we have the info, and somebody can look in there and see what's been done already. So here's the, the AIMS link below. And again, you'll all have this PowerPoint. Critical takeaways. I don't want to read this line for line, but be visible, worry about our reputation, be aware of our reputation, make sure the USG knows of our reputation and what we're up to. Make sure you're gathering all the intel that you possibly can. Make sure, make sure that we're doing regular and targeted communications. Make sure we have the external stakeholders as part of that. Showing up and knowing who everyone is obviously very critical. And make sure that we've got materials we need, and do let us know. We can't write cap statements, but we can help. We can't help, we can't write a country fact sheet, but we can help. And I'm certainly always willing to help sort of frame things in a way that's useful to the USG. And I can often even go to the USG and say, hey, in this sector, in this country, what are the things that you really care about, or what are the challenges? What have people not been doing right? And so we can help craft things that sort of meet those needs. Okay. quick update on USAID. I'm not going to go into too much detail on, say, their whole transformation process and their restructuring, because I put a lot of that online. Again, if you don't have access to Workplace, which I know some people don't, then let me know and I can just send you, I can create email lists that, blast these things out to folks, and make sure that you have all the relevant information. But on USAID's transformation, I will say they are doing a massive reorg, if you're not aware of that. Which in my mind is about 85 to 90% exactly what I would do if I were the administrator of USAID. And what I mean by that is it's sort of they're tackling kind of long-term issues that everyone's known about. Everyone has an opinion on it. If you go through and read all the sort of development jet-setty materials from all the think tanks that work on these things, which I do every day, you'll see that most people are totally in agreement with what's happening. There are a few sort of hiccups, mildly, controversial. I wouldn't even call them controversial, but things where I'm doubtful that they'll actually work. But most of it, I think, is a way for USAID to work that will actually benefit us. So, for instance, the first piece of their reorg that has actually gone through, because they can't do any of this without congressional approval, right? So they have to notify the Congress, and Congress has to, can ask them questions and say, why are you doing this? We don't want you to do this piece. And there's a conversation, and Congress has to go back and say, yes, okay, fine, you can do this. And so that has happened with the Humanitarian Bureau. So now there will be a new big boss who sits just under the USAID administrator, reports directly to the administrator, who will oversee all humanitarian and food and non-food emergencies. So some of the issues that have been identified now for 20 years or more are sort of just going to be dealt with, because there'll be leadership that oversees, for instance, all of OFTA plus all of the food. So things like Food for Peace, there's one big boss now kind of looking at all those things, and you no longer have kind of sort of two big bosses kind of competing for time and attention with the administrator. So I think that'll be really helpful. The biggest thing for me from our perspective as CARE with the whole USAID reorg is it's slowing them down. They've got Washington is consumed with this and with the journey to self-reliance, which I'll talk just a little bit about. That's their big thing, and it's what the administrator wants to happen. He knows full well that he may only have another 2 years or even less time, right? The USAID administrator can step down at any time for a variety of reasons. And I'm hopeful that Mark Green will be with us for the long haul, because he's been instrumental at protecting USAID and the money, and sort of working the Trump administration, which is, as you can imagine, is not the easiest thing to do on matters of foreign assistance. And so he's been an amazing champion. People at USAID are pretty happy with him. They like him. He's a nice guy. He helps fix problems. So hopefully he'll stick around. And the other thing that I really appreciate about him is he's very clear with his priorities, right? So this whole journey to self-reliance, again, please get on Workplace and read about it. But the journey to self-reliance is this concept that, right, there are countries that need investments in areas that will make them truly self-reliant. Philosophically, I have plenty of questions and issues with this approach. I think it's a little bit, if you read these self-reliance roadmaps, I think they're a little bit unrealistic. But the basic idea is that if you take a country like a Ghana or a Kenya, which has some pretty impressive money coming in and pretty diverse and active economies, there are approaches that USAID and USAID's implementers can take that put those countries more on the path to self-reliance, as opposed to projects that are just would always need outside funding, right? So keep that in mind as we go forward with things. If we can show that something is an investment that we're making that can be in any way self-sustaining, or where our project has led to, say, the Ministry of Health taking something on and they're just running with it, then we can also talk about self-reliance, and that's already pretty important with USAID. Like they're being forced to do this stuff, right? Like, so to the extent that we can talk about self-reliance and investments that are really being taken on and are self-sustaining is going to be important. The WE Act, the Women's Economic Empowerment Act, has become law. I don't know if any of our PAD colleagues are on the line, but we essentially helped draft this legislation and get it through the Congress and got it through the last Congress, which is sort of amazing because they didn't do a heck of a lot in terms of passing bills. So this is a huge opportunity for us. And again, you can read more, there are more details about this online that you can go through, and I encourage you to do that. What I will say is that there are a whole bunch of things that the WE Act will make USAID and other agencies have to do. And some of you in the field will know that historically USAID has not been very strong on gender. USAID has, maybe a dozen or a half dozen very strong gender folks, which is not enough for a $20 billion operation. Especially if you consider how many gender experts we have at CARE for our budget, we're doing a lot better. But this is a great opportunity to do what we were talking about, which is just help USAID think through these things. They haven't taken it very seriously in the past because it doesn't have its own bucket of money, right? So like where you've got Feed the Future with a massive bucket of money, or, basic education programs with a massive bucket of money. There hasn't been a massive bucket of money to just tackle gender and women's economic empowerment. And there still is no massive bucket of money, but there is this new Ivanka initiative, which is an initial investment of $50 million. It's money USAID already has that they're going to pull back from certain countries, and really just pipeline. So it shouldn't be too damaging to anything else we've got going on. But if you hear of that, let me know, because we like to track those things. But this Ivanka Women's Global Development or Women's Global Economic Empowerment Initiative is serious. I've gotten recent intel. Because a lot of folks have been kind of critical of it, $50 million to try to impact 50 million women. You can do the math, it's $1 per woman. It's not super impressive, but I have confirmed that that's just the start. They envision the private sector putting a lot into this, and they envision more money to be added to this fund. And they envision more agencies working on this. So they, MCC, CDC, USDA, state and others, but USAID does own the initiative and will be the sort of big player in making this happen. And so the intel that I got on the Ivanka initiative was to really start talking about this in your countries. This is a perfect example of something, if you run into USAID folks, ask them about this, because the way they're going to roll this out is going to be in countries where they've got the most interest, where like the ambassador is pushing for it, the mission director, where they've got existing programs that make sense. Because that's, rule number one to USAID, like always put your money into something that's already working, and then you can take easy credit for it, right? They do this all the time, especially with initiatives. Once an initiative is sort of proven to be working, they love to then just, keep funding it and keep talking about the great results they're getting. So that's all I'll say on those things. I mean, I just want to highlight again that, helping USAID figure this stuff out is a huge opportunity for us. And the PAD folks, I don't know if anybody from PAD again is on this call, but the PAD folks are developing materials that we can use. And they did, I participated with Gayatri in another webinar that PAD ran on the WE Act and the Ivanka initiative. And so you can get that webinar. I believe it was recorded. You can listen to that if you missed it. But do think about those two things and think about showing off our gender work in the USAID missions, because that's going to be big going forward. And then lastly, getting to USAID, if you have no inroads into USAID, I can help you with that, like guaranteed. Like there's not anywhere in the USAID world that I can't eventually get you into. It may not be right away. It might take a while, but we can do it. So do let me know. Questions, comments? What do you guys need from CBU?
So first off, thank you, Sean, for that great presentation and for taking time to share all of that. We do have a couple of questions online. And I know we got some questions that were sent in advance of the training. From online, Andrew has a question. Do you have strong contacts at USAID regional offices, specifically Dakar?
I do. Send me an email.
Great, done. The next one, I can probably take this one. How closely or not, in the case of FNS, do you work with KML technical advisors? Dovetailing in country and in Washington, DC materials, distribution, meeting invitations, etc. Seems like a great way to leverage multiple contacts strategically. So I'll be honest, in the past has not been a strength for us, but we did bring on a KML coordinator last year, and that's been a really great opportunity to try to link up more closely with all of the KML folks here on the HQ side as well. And so I think this is an area where we can improve and certainly open to ideas. I also think that the new ILCA team and PPL, we've been working closely with them as well as the marketing team to just say there's a lot of stuff out there, but we're not streamlining it, we're not channeling it to really reach our clients. So I think this has been a gap for us, but it's one that we're aware of and trying to improve. And Shelly Nix is our KML coordinator. And then Sugler had a question for you, Sean. We know the USG regulatory environment has been changing significantly under the new administration, especially for specific countries. Do you think that increased risk aversion, fear of aid diversion, et cetera, will impact funding available in the future?
Well, that's a tricky one. I think, to me, the biggest risk, so yeah, I think it's an issue, but it's probably not as big an issue as what we've seen happening with what I will call disfavorable countries, right? Like with this administration, there's a huge push. I mean, right, you can hear the president talk about how he wants to take all aid money away from, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, right? The takers, all they do is take our money and send us their migrants, and they're all gang members, right? Like, so there's that rhetoric that is present, and it is having an impact. And so, I just had a conversation recently with the senior desk officer on Pakistan with USAID, and right, they are, like, USAID themselves is worried about money being taken away from Pakistan because, the administration is just not happy with Pakistan. So that, we've seen Gaza and West Bank shut down, right? Zero USAID ongoing work. I mean, I believe that when there's new administration, they'll probably reopen that office, although it's a shame because, you never giving even an inch on capacity in these places, as is really setting you back for a variety of reasons. So to me, the riskier thing is not just what they're trying to do with regulations and running a sort of, less, like avoiding things like corruption or mismanagement. And I think the bigger risk is simply countries that are on the naughty list of President Trump and others, because we are seeing that sort of happening, and that can be bad. And if you have specific questions around those, what are those countries, or you're in one of those countries and it's challenging, do let me know. And I work with my PAD colleagues constantly on these issues, because we are, our job in CBU is really, when it comes to engagement, it's really to be working on the executive branch side, right? Like, we don't do stuff on the Hill, except we help you. If you're coming to Washington, I'll hook you up with Pat and I'll take you to the Hill. But that Hill engagement piece, we are excellent at that as CARE. I can't tell you how impressed I am with, not just drafting these bills and getting things passed that are inherently super good for CARE in our business, and helping the people that we really care about. But we're also really good at sort of, if there's something that scares us at USAID, like they're moving in a direction that we really don't agree with, our people can talk to the Hill about that, and to the Hill staffers who, make USAID do everything, right? So we have those relationships and that clout on the Hill. So do let us know if you have concerns and what you need help with. I hope that answered the question.
I would add one thing to that. I do think it's important for us to recognize that there's still a lot of untapped funding for us within the U.S. government. We've succeeded very well on our HT portfolio, Food for Peace, All of that we're doing quite well. But there's several other sectors where there's substantial money and we have the expertise, but we have not been successful at growing those portfolios, or we're just not pursuing things. Last year, 24% of bids we did not pursue simply because we didn't get a response from the country office. So that's a point that we are actively trying to work on to figure out how we can better work with all of our country office counterparts to figure out how can we make sure that you guys know what's coming up, and how can we work together to really take a more targeted approach to portfolio growth. So there's a lot changing, and we are actively adapting to those. You'll see in the coming weeks, we'll put out an FY16 to FY18 USG analysis, which goes into substantial detail of where we've been performing well as an organization, where we are successful in our USG relationships and fundraising, and where we're not, as well as what are the trends happening in the U.S. government that we need to prepare for and pivot for. But part of this is also making sure that we're actively working together for the funding that is there, to make sure that we are pursuing everything that is relevant to us, that fits into our wheelhouse and makes sense. Okay, we have another question.
Yep.
As I focus on business development for the Global We team, I'm supporting Nilofar, Christian, etc. The opportunities for positioning and influencing thinking on We with USAID is great to hear. I'm already connected to some colleagues, but will send you a specific follow-up email on We specifically if I may. How we can prioritize and get our key messages on We out more systematically. One question. Is the existing capacity statement repository accessible to non-CARE US colleagues? I can answer that. So it is accessible to some of our non-CARE USA colleagues. So for those of you who don't know, you can go onto our SharePoint site and access all of the capacity statements that we are aware of, as well as project summaries for all CARE programming. There's obviously some we don't have, and we do encourage you, when you have project summary or past performance reference or capacity statement, please do send it to us and we'll put it in that repository. That right now is accessible to everybody in CARE USA as well as most of CI. However, CARE Australia country offices as well as CARE India, and I think there might be a couple others in there, do not have access, and that's a problem on the IT side that we are aware of, and we are actively working with them. There's an entire team of us working with them on this point. So hopefully it'll be solved soon. In the meantime, if there is something specifically that you need, feel free to email Shelly Nix on our team, and she can make sure that you get the documents or whatnot that you request.
Thank you, Christy. Should we, I don't know if there are more sort of live questions, but should we go through the ones that were asked ahead of time?
Sure.
Great. Let me start with number one, which is really a tough one. The dynamicity in terms of thematic priorities and HR composition. This is really, I'm not even sure I understand this, but I love it. Especially the development sector has exponentially increased over the course of the last decade. I think I know what they're saying, yeah. So should COs be prioritizing long-term positioning, or should we divert more of our focus and resources and attention to short-term positioning? To me, this is really a Christy question. I can talk about what I sort of think are the global trends. But Christy, do you want to take a stab at that?
So I think it's a complicated question, but I think part of the question is, where should we really be allocating our resources, right? So whenever we're thinking about all the many things that we have to do, what should we prioritize? It's a tough question. However, what I will say is that too often in CARE, we do just tackle what's immediately in front of us, and it is really important that we are thinking more long-term. I've seen several examples since I've been with CARE of country offices waiting until the funding's running out, and then they start to prioritize business development. Business development fundraising really has to be an ongoing effort. I think for one thing that I would say is that please do reach out to us as you're doing your business planning, as you're looking at kind of everything that's on the forecast, or looking at long-term positioning, and we can support you in prioritizing of, based on the resources that you have, what to focus on and where you can kind of have the biggest bang for your efforts. I don't know that really fully answers the question, but that would be my response for now. Sean, I don't know if you have something more just kind of overall development trends.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of these questions, folks are all alluding to. In fact, number 2 has a little bit to do with this. This idea that sort of care is care, and we do our care thing. That could be a problem, obviously, with how we choose to go after things, or you see a lot of like, oh, well, we just don't do that, or that's not the way we do things, and so we're not going to apply for that. I'm a real big believer that we can do both. And I am, admittedly a creature of Washington, where I think, most things can be spun. But I do think that we have a set of natural assets as care that are just terrific for the USG. So like for me, so many of our issues are based around, communications, materials, and not spending the time developing these relationships, right? Our problem is not that we don't do great work. It's not that we don't have the great ideas or the great people, right? We have all of those things. So to me, the short term is obviously important, but like where we can get serious bang for our buck is really thinking about this long-term positioning, because there's 2 pieces to it, right? Like we're positioning ourselves to win big bids that the USG comes up with, but at the same time we're also influencing what big bids they're going to actually create, right? I mean, that's essential. Like we can't not do that and expect to sort of even can't expect to even maintain our USG portfolio if we're not doing the long-term relationship building. So that's how I would answer that. Like we have to do the long-term, but obviously we do the short-term too.
Thanks for that, Sean. We're at time, so we need to wrap up. I think one kind of final point to leave you guys with, it's the point we've been emphasizing over and over, is that with long-term positioning, it's not just about the fundraising aspect. It's really about influencing and partnering with our USG colleagues and any donor for that matter, and influencing the way they think about development. We have so much knowledge about the context. We have so much knowledge about what works and what doesn't, and we really want to make sure that we're actively sharing that. That does influence the way that our clients and our donors think about development, and as such, how they design projects that we will then eventually pursue. So it definitely gives us a competitive advantage and opens up fundraising opportunities. But particularly with the U.S. government as the largest bilateral donor in the world, the opportunity to really influence the way they think, helping them to understand what impact does it actually have when we prioritize gender? That allows us to multiply our impact so substantially, in that we can see some of the best approaches and best practices that we know to actually begin to show up in the way that USAID thinks about and approaches both humanitarian and development programming. So on that note, we'll end. Please do, if you have additional questions or would like any support from CBU, please do email us, and we will do what we can.
I will.
Yeah.
I'll answer the questions that we had submitted. I'll answer and put online.
Great, thank you. All right, bye everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you, Sean.
All right, thanks, Sean.